The background and purpose of this is, the idea is there's a lot of workers out there who can't afford to take time off when they're sick, when their kids are sick, when there's a domestic violence situation. And so the city of Seattle, in its wisdom, has decided to force all employers of workers in Seattle to provide paid time off for these purposes. It's been introduced on a statewide level, so it may come into effect on a statewide level, but our understanding right now is in the legislature it's been tabled for now, so it's not on the immediate horizon. What's on the immediate horizon is this ordinance, which does go into effect September 1st, 2012, and from my discussions with other employment law attorneys in the city, there's no talk of it being challenged. There's not a lot of basis to challenge it, and nobody seems to have any sort of momentum towards challenging it, so we just need to prepare for it. Okay, so who does it apply to? It's easy to think, okay, I'm not located in Seattle, so it doesn't apply to me. The way we need to look at it is it's focused on the worker, where the worker works. So if a person works in Seattle more than 240 hours in a calendar year, and their employer has more than 4 full-time equivalent employees, then that worker accrues paid time off. So it's based on where the worker is working. So you're not located in Seattle, it may still apply to some of your employees. It doesn't matter where the employer itself is located.
Does that include across state? Because how do they have jurisdiction?
Because the thinking is the jurisdiction applies because there's somebody located in Seattle. And that's one of the possible challenges, is that the Seattle city government has overstepped its boundaries in trying to regulate companies located out of Seattle, but the nexus is that there are employees located in Seattle, so therefore they get to regulate.
Does that mean they're living in Seattle, or they happen to work in Seattle?
Working in Seattle. So workers who are traveling into Seattle to provide services. So as one attorney put it, where their feet are on the ground. If they're in Seattle when they're providing their services, they're working in Seattle, and it counts towards this 240 hours a year. So they are entitled to paid sick leave and paid safe leave. And it's not two separate things. It's one accumulation that can be used for either purpose.
Okay, I have a quick question. If it's effective September 1, but the accrual basis is a calendar year, why wouldn't it be effective January? Why September 1?
That's a question for the Seattle City Council.
Okay.
I think it's just a year from when they signed it into law. But there's carryover requirements for calendar years, so it kind of gets blurred anyway. As we said, carry forward requirements, and there's also reporting requirements for employers, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the program. Okay, so we already talked about, basically, it applies regardless of where the employer is, and our slide says statewide. I haven't seen anything that doesn't say it doesn't apply to no matter where the employer is located, even Boise or Boston. If they have a worker in Seattle, that worker gets paid time. The last line includes full-time, part-time, casual, and temporary. This is what Angela is concerned about, and Bob is concerned about also, because a lot of companies that have paid time off policies just apply it to their full-time workers. This applies to everyone who works 240 hours in a calendar year. And what they do is they look at your previous calendar year to try to determine that in terms of eligibility.
The other thing I wanted just to point out here is you see a lot of things that say 5 or more, and it actually is more than 4.
Correct.
So if you have part-time people, it's the adding up the full-time equivalents.
Right.
And so it's not 5.
So
it's
if you
more
have
than 4.
4.5,
Yeah. So that's just
you're over this limit. Yeah,
I've
and
seen a lot of materials that say 5.
Right, and it's more than 4. And that's very important, especially when we're doing this full-time equivalent.
Is there any exception for 501c3s, or?
Not my understanding, because 501c3s aren't exempt from employment taxes. They still are in the worker compensation pool, so they still are subject to Fair Labor Standards Acts and all of those things. So. Okay, so what is sick leave? Obviously sick leave is if the employee is ill. That's pretty much a given. But it also applies to preventative care, wellness checks, or to get diagnosis or care of treatment of a mental or physical condition. And it applies not only to the employee, but the employee's family members as defined in the ordinance, which is the employee's children, the employee's parents, the employee's spouse or domestic partner, the spouse or domestic partner's parents, so your parents-in-law, and your grandparents. Not siblings. Siblings are left out, but pretty much this whole group. And so if you have an employee who has a child who has a well child visit, that would count under this. It's preventative care. So it's not just sick leave, it's health care related time. So a little broader. Yeah.
Question. So domestic partner, is that based on a certain duration of time that the couple have been together, or is there a city or state definition?
That's a good question. I haven't looked specifically at how they're defining that, whether it needs to be a registered domestic partner or whether it just needs to be a live-in person. But we can get clarification on that.
Well, really it just gets down to the point that once they accrue the sick leave, they're going to be able to claim it. They can just say I'm sick or whatever, right?
That kind of gets to that gets to a different issue of, truthfulness and our employees using the leave as it's intended. And that's maybe an issue of culture in a company, or maybe it's just part of the collateral damage of this ordinance. We don't know because it's not in effect yet. But they don't get paid. They don't get paid out for this leave. They get to take paid leave, and there's a little bit of a difference. So they can't cash it out and then still continue working. It's not like when you leave your position and you've got accrued leave and you get to be paid for that leave. There's no requirement in this ordinance that employers do that. Basically, you use it as paid leave, but you're not required to cash it out.
So along those same lines, then, so if you have a seasonal employee that's only employed for 5-6 months,
Right.
they leave right at the end of that, come back, possibly they may be rehired 6 months later. Does that accrual that they had already accrued during that prior 6 months stick?
In some cases, the ordinance provides for rehires within 7 months.
Okay.
So that may be a planning issue with you as to what that length of time is.
7 months from the date of separation.
Correct.
Okay.
I'll say that again about the 7-month rule. What's that?
If you have someone who leaves your employment and comes back within 7 months, then what they accrued beforehand is still around. They're entitled to, it's a continuation of employment.
Even if it's another calendar year?
Yes, because there are the carryover requirements from calendar year to calendar year.
So it seems that there aren't a lot of definitions. For instance, is there defining to take the paid time off? Do they have to show any type of proof? Do they have to visit a doctor? Do they have to?
We will get to that.
And is there a definition on how close the grandparents and parents live?
No.
If I got a sick person in Boston, I can fly out there and take all the time off I need to make sure that they are well taken care of.
Well, take all the time off you need. It depends on how much time you have accrued.
Okay.
You can't take more than you've accrued unless your employer is willing to let you take an advance on your leave. This law provides for minimums. You have to allow a certain amount of paid time off. It doesn't say that you can take off as much paid time as you want for whatever purpose might fit in this. And so, the employees are also required to use their other leave too, or do unpaid leave if they're going over what they've accrued. So, and the law does have more definitive definitions. We didn't want to fill up our slides with, have all you guys reading instead of actually listening.
And there is, if you're gone for more than 3 days, there are documentation requirements. You can request that.
Great, I touched something I shouldn't have touched, Michelle, now I
Just hit escape.
Sorry, escape.
Just hit escape. Yeah, and then.
Can I ask one more question?
Uh-huh.
Does the accrual then start on September 1st, 2012? Or what if employees have been on the payroll for much longer than
It
that?
starts on September 1st, 2012 for current employees.
Okay.
So you don't have to take into account time that they've gotten up to that point. And then for new employees, it starts on their date of hire, which if it's after September 1st.
Okay.
Okay, so what is safe leave? Safe leave is much more broadly defined. It is, for instance, this first bullet, if an employee's child's school is closed because there's a gas leak, and so the employee needs to go home and take care of his child, that's covered. If an employee needs to assist a family member in obtaining a restraining order, that's covered. If an employee needs to seek treatment or obtain services related to domestic violence or stalking or sexual assault, that's covered. Or maybe to obtain a safe place to live for the employee and her children. Family member, very broadly defined. So it's, with sick leave, it's a fairly narrow definition. This actually includes dating relationships and former dating relationships and former dating relationships of your family members. So your employee's 17-year-old daughter's ex-boyfriend who's making threats to your family, they can take time off for that. And the intent is they want employees to be able to be safe. And so they're trying to enable them to get paid time off to keep themselves and their families safe. It's pretty broad. So again, it goes back to that trust issue of you and your employees, and are they abusing the system? The leave is not unlimited. It's certain levels of leave. So it remains to be seen how this is going to bear out. This isn't in effect yet. Angela, did you have a question?
Well, I thought of one, but you said mine.
Sorry. Well, if it
So
comes
if you-
back to you.
So if you have, let's say, salaried employees that in the past, you never tracked or cared when they needed to go for a doctor's appointment or whatever, you just assume that, they're salaried, they're going
Right.
to work then. So is this a situation where we would want to start having them document the time and reporting the time that they really are leaving the office for medical purposes?
You're required to allow them to accrue a certain amount of time and use a certain amount of time. And there are reporting requirements that you have to provide to your employees every pay period how many hours they've accrued. Whether you want to then track how much they've used to make sure that you're complying with the law and letting them use enough, that's probably advised.
Okay.
The issue of salaried employees is an interesting one because we'll get to that in I think just another slide. Rate of accrual is different for hourly employees than for salaried employees, slightly.
Okay.
And so let's see what, here we go. Okay, so employees are entitled to accrue time based on the hours they work in Seattle. If they work for an employer with more than 4 full-time equivalent employees, they are, and fewer than 50 full-time equivalent employees, they accrue 1 hour for every 40 hours worked. That's for hourly employees. If you're a salaried employee, you accrue 1 hour for every 40 hours worked, but you cannot count time that would be overtime.
Okay.
So if a hourly employee works 50 hours in a week, they count that 50 hours, so they get 1.25 hours of accrued leave. If a salaried employee works 50 hours in a week, it counts as 40. So that raises even more complexity of how are you tracking for hourly employees and salaried employees.
So it's the same rate of accrual, it's just that for salary employees, they can't ever really go over
Right.
40 hours.
So
a week.
one way to think about it maybe is that hourly employees are paid for every hour they work.
Right,
They may be paid regular time or overtime, but they're paid for every hour.
right.
Salaried employees are basically, they're paid the same whether they work 30 or 50. So you're just counting full-time employees that are working 40 hours. So,
Okay,
go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, the nuance here is that these are the minimums, so, because most of the time, I'm assuming that a salaried employee has, set, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of vacation a year, or a bank of PTO.
Right.
Is this over and above and separate from that PTO bank, or is this just saying, hey, you have to get X number of PTO for?
This is minimum time that employees have to be allowed to accrue for the purposes of sick and safe.
So if you're in an organization, you're a law firm, as an example, you might know a little about that. It really isn't gonna impact you because you already kind of have that stuff built in.
Most likely, by and large, you're correct in that it's probably not going to affect them in terms of the amount of leave they're allowing their employees. Where it is going to affect them is the reporting requirements, the carryover requirements, because there are some firms that are use it or lose it. You accrue it during the year, and if you don't use it by the end of the year, it's gone.
Right.
You can't do that under this ordinance. You have to allow certain levels of carryover.
But I'm just trying to, kind of contextualize, maybe we'll get to it, but as far as from professional services firms, for organizations that have got, by and large, reasonable employee benefit programs in place already that include PTO and all that kind of stuff, it's gonna be more of a reporting issue, but when you start getting into, hospitality, restaurants, hotels, that's where you're gonna start seeing people say, okay, well, we're gonna lay people off, we're gonna bust everybody back down to minimum wage to pay for this, and that's where maybe the adverse impact might be more felt.
That's a good question. I mean, companies that have paid time off policies, this doesn't necessarily require more paid time off. What it's going to affect them is reporting and carryovers. Companies that don't have paid time off policies, this is a new requirement. Now they have to provide paid time off for all employees who work in Seattle more than 240 hours. So how companies are going to deal with that in terms of allocating the costs, we're going to have to see. We do have the example of other cities that have put this type of policy in place, and they had much the same reaction that a lot of companies here are having, which is, oh my God, the costs are going to be phenomenal and we can't handle this. And a lot of the cities have found that it's not quite as bad as they expected. There's not as much abuse as they expected, so we're going to have to see.
Okay.
So back to the accrual. So they've split employers into 3 tiers. If you have more than 4 full-time employees but fewer than 50, then your workers accrue 1 hour for every 40 hours worked. They have to be allowed to use up to 40 hours a year, and they have to be allowed to carry over 40 hours into the next year.
Is that an account?
What happens?
That's a calendar year.
And what is the calendar year defined? January
January
through,
through
although
December.
we're basing accrual on September to September?
They're basing accrual starting on your first day of work or the first day of the ordinance. And then, so you accrue for actual time worked. You have to be allowed to carry 40 hours over if you've accrued them, up to 40 hours into the next year.
So in year 1, it's unlikely, let's say, that anybody's going to be carrying over more than 40. But
Right.
So in this first year, it's kind of
Yeah.
confusing. But
So you accrue starting September 1st, and whatever you've accrued and not used
right.
on January 1st, you get to carry it over.
Okay.
So can we take our paid time off policies and knock them down to what this is?
Sure.
Okay.
This is a
Because
minimum.
this is a minimum.
This is a
Because
minimum.
I just see some of my companies saying, oh, right on. I can knock those down.
Well, and then there.
I mean, I don't know that they
What
would,
does
but
that do with
when
their-
you look at it,
Yeah.
if we put this verbiage into our current paid time off policy, well, then we're in compliance. And-
Yeah,
and
these are minimums.
Okay.
So if you're a tier 2 employer, you have more than, at least 50 employees and fewer than 250, the accrual rate is still the same, 1 hour for every 40 hours worked, but you have to allow up to 56 hours of paid time per year, and you have to allow them to carry that 56 forward if they have it.
How long can they carry something forward? For example, say they work for 3 years and they never get sick.
So
Yeah.
can they carry up to like 120 hours? Does it carry
Sure.
on forever?
Sure, they can carry it on, you don't have to let them use it. You have to let them use 40 hours.
Do you have to pay
So-
that out if they leave?
No, you can choose to do that. The ordinance does not require paying out unused but accrued time. Eli?
So maximum carry forward to next year, I originally read that as at the end of each year, only 40 hours gets carried over. It didn't matter if you had 40 hours from year before last added to it, and you kept accruing, and you got to like 60 by the end of the year. Only
That's-
40 hours carries over, or does the whole 60?
No,
carry?
you're right, and that goes to Bob's point, you're right. They have to be allowed to carry over that much. That's the minimum that they have to be allowed to carry over, but then they'll continue to accrue. So in a way, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So if I carry 40 hours over to the next year, I've already got as much as you are required to let me use. So all the accrual that I do over that, you don't have to let me use it.
Well, you'd probably end up using, I mean, it gives you the ability to take up that 40 hours in January,
Exactly.
so that makes sense.
Exactly, I mean, and I think that's the idea.
And then you can't
behind
use
it.
anything until the following January.
Well,
Depending on how the employer decides to handle this. So, and then if you're a big employer with 250 or more employees, then it jumps up, then it actually changes the accrual rate. You accrue 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, and you have to be allowed to use 72 hours and carry over 72 hours. So they do, the accrual rate actually changes in that
So
case.
is the definitive marker the maximum use per year? Going back to the accrual and everything, I haven't used any this year, so I've accrued 40, I can get another 40 accrued. I don't have 80, I'm only, as an employer, required to pay them for 40 hours per year.
You're required to allow them to use 40 hours a year.
So if they have
Right.
80,
Right,
so
You
yes,
don't
I
have
carry
to let them
forward
use it.
them.
right.
And most employees are going to be using their 40 in the
Right.
calendar year. Oh,
Probably.
December 25th, I'm sick.
Right.
Right. And again, that's, how is this going to shake out in real life? How is this actually going to be implemented?
One additional point, I just looked at the first bullet, is new employers within the first 2 years of hiring a first employee, this doesn't apply. So for businesses that are just starting, even if they start out building a factory, hiring 50 people, it doesn't apply to them for 2 years.
Right.
So, but if they are the tier 3.
Right, so if you open a factory and hire 300 people, it applies.
So wait, does that apply to entirely new business entities? What if it's the same umbrella company, but then there are multiple divisions that operate almost as
Separate
completely
entity,
distinct business?
I
Right.
think.
Okay.
Yeah, if it's a separate entity, and it's not from the date of formation, it's the date of the first employee.
Got it.
So if you have an owner-operated company with no employees and it's been in existence for 10 years, and then it hires somebody, you know, so they haven't been subject to it until then.
So, Dini, you said it was as long as the employee worked at least 240 hours a year? So if I've got a good friend of mine has a event business. They do these casino parties for, and so they hire these people part-time. They go out and they do these things after hours, whatever. So if I'm him, my strategy may be to say, I'm gonna set a maximum number of, I'm not gonna hire anybody for more than 220 hours a year. And so that's probably a good thing, is, you know, just build in a buffer and say no more than 220 a year.
Absolutely, I think that's a legitimate strategy to avoiding this ordinance.
Okay.
So then it just comes down to, does he want to be employed? Like in my case, I was thinking through that and doing the math. Do I want to hire, instead of 15 guys, now I'm going to have to hire 30, just so that they don't hit
Right.
this number? I don't know if I want to be managing another 15
Yeah, and
people
there's
on
the-
payroll for this.
And the
you know?
cost benefit of the, you know, the transition costs, the training costs, the non-continuity,
Right.
you know, even maybe employee retention, if you are deliberately treating your employees in this way, do they even want to work for you?
So, do they, there's this issue of you don't know if an employee is a 240-hour-a-year employee or not at the beginning.
Right.
They do have part-time labor.
Mhm.
So do they start accruing from day one, but they're not allowed to take it until they're after 240 hours? Or
What a good
do
question.
they start accruing after 240 hours?
It's 180 days.
I believe 240 hours would be 6 weeks.
240
A full
hours
time.
is, at an 8-hour day is 30 days.
But if you're looking at 40 hours a
But I
week,
think they can't take it for 180 days after. their
correct,
birthday.
correct.
So
So,
it's kind of a waiting period.
right, but the question is, are you accruing? And I guess I would say, since you have to have the reporting requirements in, the reporting mechanism in place anyway, let them accrue. If they leave before the 240 hours, they haven't, you just wipe it out. It doesn't count.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So again, it's how is this gonna work? We don't exactly know because it hasn't started yet.
Just don't wipe it out before the 7-month thing.
Right,
Right. That's a
right.
good point.
Yeah.
Do you know if payroll companies like ADP and CompuPay are really getting on this so that they can, cause so many clients are
Yeah.
gonna be up in arms with this whole reporting
Right.
piece of it.
I've not heard one way or another. You
Okay.
would think that as a matter of customer service, they have to be up on this to offer this service to their
Well,
clients.
and I talked to our payroll company, which is a small company,
Yeah.
and she's like, most companies have some way to accrue vacation and accrue
Right.
time in their systems, and it's gonna be flipping some switches and
Okay.
incorporating it. The piece that's probably more complicated is where you have employees that are sometimes working in Seattle and sometimes working elsewhere, because you're gonna have to track that differently. So you have to have two different timekeeping mechanisms. So if you're in Seattle, you track it as, Seattle time. If you're in Bellevue, you track it as Bellevue or non-Seattle time, right? And that's the piece that's probably gonna add more complexity. And we're gonna talk a little about that later too.
Got it.
And can we define employee too, because I'm thinking about all these different things like people who are working from home, who might be working for, I guess it wouldn't be as big a deal, if you're working from home, you kind of have that handled anyway, but, I don't know, when you're starting to push into that gray area between W-2 and 1099.
Shouldn't be a gray area. Washington's pretty strict on this is an employee and this is an independent contractor. And if your relationship with your independent contractor is gray,
Yeah.
chances are the state's gonna say it's an employee.
Yeah.
So there are definitive factors that you must meet to be an independent contractor. So
There's a
working from
difference.
home is not definitive. It's business structure of that independent contractor.
There's a difference between what Employment Security considers an employee and what LMI considers an employee in specific job categories, I will tell you that.
Okay. But they do have their definite factors that your independent contractor must have a business structure, a UBI, set up to pay business taxes,
But loggers,
have their
however,
own,
get covered by LMI.
right, controlling direction, all of those issues. And so it really shouldn't be gray. If you're worried that maybe your independent contractors aren't independent contractors, you need to address that, not just from a Seattle sick leave point of view, but from an employment security point of view and an L&I point of view.
Well, it's really, doesn't the L&I really govern as far as the 6 criteria that they post that you have to be the?
Not any, because I've sat through audit through both, and I have, case in point is I have an arborist, and he subcontracted his logging, he didn't want to do the high logging. But L&I says we don't care, that yes, they are an independent contractor and everything, but you're gonna pay their L&I while they're on your job. Whereas Employment Security says, no, you're not responsible for their SUDET.
So no unemployment taxes, but there are workers' comp. Wow.
Well, I'm thinking about you, Gordon. Yeah, I mean, how is that gonna apply to an organization like yours where you're sending out folks to work in a temporary environment with the idea that you're not really paying these people, you're having somebody else pay them for you. Now all of a sudden, you're gonna have to be making payments out of your,
Their W-2s.
Well, yeah, they're W-2s to this company.
We have to.
So, yeah.
We pay them for the practices that we send them to, so they're technically our employees.
And we're gonna address the issue of temporary workers in one of our scenarios if we get there. Okay. All right, we've already addressed all of these except for the very last one. So, and to Michelle's point and Eli's question about, you don't know if an employee is going to get 240 hours, do you start accruing? They can't use it until 180 days after they've been hired.
How about,
Or 100, and this is for new employees. This is not for people who are already employed as of September 1st. So with people who are your employees on the effective date of this law, they can start using as soon as they accrue. But of course, they're only accruing an hour a week. So, and that's another issue is how do you let them take it? Are they taking it on a per hour basis, a half day basis? And the law is not totally clear on that.
so there's not a wait period for the current employees?
Correct. Correct. So notice requirements, somebody raised that earlier about what can you require in terms of doctor's note and things like that. Actually, this is notice in terms of how much notice does an employee need to give you. If it's foreseeable, you're adopting a child, you've got a surgery scheduled, you need to give your employer 10 days notice. If it's unforeseeable, it needs to be as soon as possible. I mean, let's be reasonable. If you're in a car accident, you're not going to give your employer notice that you have to take leave. Regarding documentation, employers cannot require documentation of a need for leave if it's fewer than 3 consecutive days. You cannot. And that may be in conflict with your current policy. So you need to make sure that you are in compliance with that. More than 3 consecutive days, you can require documentation. So for sick leave, you can require a doctor's note or a note from the therapist or some sort of documentation that this sick leave is justified. You may not, cannot inquire into the reason. What is the illness? What is the condition? What you can require is documentation that the leave is medically needed. For safe leave,
Wait, so when you
yes.
say more than 3 days, is that, 3.1, are we talking about, is it?
The law says
just wanna
more
make
than
sure-
3 consecutive days.
Okay,
So if
3
you're-
or fewer.
Correct.
Okay,
So if you as an employer, if somebody says I've taken 3 consecutive days and I need another half day and you want to say,
right.
got to bring a doctor's note, the law says more than 3 consecutive days. So, okay. We've talked about all of these. Documentation after 3 consecutive paid time off. You have to provide notice of accrual each pay period. And we also talked about you can provide more. These are minimums. This is what you have to provide. If you want to provide more for whatever reason, you can do that.